Yesterday, a single corporate filing landed on my desk that completely strips away the political theatre in Ottawa and reveals the real architecture of North American energy power. While politicians line up behind microphones to talk about Canadian energy independence and building a domestic superpower, the country's largest pipeline giant quietly signalled where the actual power and growth live. Enbridge, a company built on Alberta engineering and headquartered in Calgary, effectively completed its transformation into an American utility empire. This is not routine corporate restructuring. It is a massive, structural capital flight that shifts the geopolitical balance between Canada and the United States. To understand how we arrived at this pivotal moment, look at the timeline of how Enbridge systematically moved its centre of gravity south of the border. For decades, Enbridge operated primarily as the central artery of Canadian crude. Its massive mainline system carried heavy bitumen from the Alberta oil sands straight down into the refining hubs of the American Midwest and Gulf Coast. That footprint already made Enbridge vital to Washington's energy security, but it remained a fundamentally Canadian pipeline company. That reality shattered in late 2023. Enbridge announced a blockbuster $14 billion acquisition, buying 3 major regulated natural gas utilities from Dominion Energy, East Ohio Gas, Public Service Company of North Carolina, and Questar Gas in Utah. The official narrative from corporate public relations framed this as a simple diversification strategy, a smoothing out of cash flows through stable, regulated consumer markets. That is the peace offering for conservative institutional investors. But here is the other half that the mainstream financial media completely missed. This single transaction overnight turned a Canadian pipeline operator into the single largest natural gas utility on the entire North American continent, serving millions of meters across 3 red and blue American states. By the time the calendar flipped to 2026, those utilities were fully integrated, and the corporate data proved that Enbridge's growth engine had officially relocated. The strategic logic behind this $14 billion bet becomes undeniable when you look at the hard, verifiable numbers. In its early 2026 reporting, Enbridge revealed that its secured growth backlog had climbed past $40 billion. That is a massive 35% jump from its previous investor cycle. But look closely at where that fresh capital is actually landing. It is not funding new major corridors across British Columbia or Ontario. Instead, it is locked into major American gas transmission expansions, like the Ridgeline Project, Aspen Point, and Longview, all scheduled to enter service across 2026. Enbridge also doubled down on American shale by expanding its stake in the multi-billion-dollar Matterhorn natural gas pipeline, which pumps Permian Basin gas straight to the Gulf Coast. Of the roughly $8 billion in new projects entering service this year, the vast majority sits firmly inside American territory. This aggressive southern tilt has paid off handsomely, creating a profound financial divergence between corporate success and Canadian national policy. Enbridge's full-year 2025 adjusted earnings reached a record $20 billion, marking a 7% increase driven almost entirely by its new American utility assets and export terminals. Distributable cash flow climbed to $12.5 billion, allowing the company to extend its dividend increase streak to 31 consecutive years. This elite status as a dividend aristocrat ensures that massive pools of global pension and retirement money keep flowing into Enbridge's balance sheet. Enbridge is now deploying 10 billion Canadian dollars in self-funded growth capital without issuing a single new equity share. The company has total financial discipline and absolute choice over where it spends its money. And time after time, its board chooses American infrastructure over Canadian projects. Now, where is this shift more glaring than at the Enbridge Ingleside Energy Center in Texas? It is the largest crude oil export terminal in the United States, and it has become the crown jewel of Enbridge's entire asset portfolio. As geopolitical volatility chokes maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, global demand has shifted massively towards secure American coastal infrastructure. Enbridge's chief executive recently called this the strongest growth window in over a decade. But notice the geography. That window is opening wide in Texas, not in Alberta. Every single barrel of crude that leaves Ingleside is a barrel that Canada no longer controls. It is transported through American networks, refined by American workers, taxed by American authorities, and exported under an American flag. Meanwhile, Enbridge is aggressively maximising the evacuation of Canada's resource wealth to feed this southern engine. The company recently sanctioned its Mainline Optimisation Phase 1 project, a move that adds 150,000 barrels per day of crude capacity. Much of that volume flows directly through an expanded Flanagan South pipeline, which cuts from the Midwest straight down to the Texas Gulf Coast. Enbridge is currently running open bidding to lock in an additional 250,000 barrels per day of export capacity, with 200,000 barrels of that allocation earmarked specifically for Flanagan South. The mainline system is currently operating at an astronomical average of 3.2 million barrels a day, among the highest utilisation rates in corporate history. The pipeline architecture is clear. Western Canadian resources are being drawn south faster and more efficiently than ever before, directly serving American industrial dominance. This brings us to the core contradiction facing policymakers in Ottawa. Mark Carney has built a political platform centred on economic sovereignty, repeatedly promising to diversify trade and insulate Canada from American economic pressure. He speaks frequently about transforming Canada into an energy superpower. Yet, while Ottawa drafts position papers, the country's premier energy company is voting with its capital. This is not a matter of corporate disloyalty. It is a cold calculation of regulatory math. Capital follows returns, and right now, Canada's regulatory environment is broken. The history of Canadian energy infrastructure is a graveyard of cancelled ambitions. The Northern Gateway pipeline was killed after years of legal warfare. Energy East was abandoned under the weight of shifting regulatory goalposts before a single mile of pipe was laid. Even the state-backed Trans Mountain expansion faced agonising years of delays and catastrophic cost overruns due to jurisdictional battles between provinces and the federal government. Environmental review processes regularly stretch across half a decade, and complex consultation requirements extend approval timelines indefinitely. For a corporate board managing billions of dollars of shareholder money, time is a literal cost. Compare that bureaucratic gridlock with the current operational realities south of the border. While Washington and Ottawa engage in highly publicised trade disputes over tariffs and dairy quotas, the American federal government has quietly streamlined permitting for critical gas and pipeline infrastructure, explicitly treating energy assets as matters of urgent national security. This political tailwind makes American projects faster to execute, cheaper to build, and significantly less risky to finance. Boards do not need ideology to understand which side wins this equation. They just need a calculator. Ottawa is fully aware of this existential threat to its tax base and job market. Every dollar of EBITDA generated in Ohio, North Carolina, or Texas pays taxes to American governments, completely bypassing Canadian public coffers. In a direct response to this hemorrhaging of capital, the Canadian government passed the Building Canada Act, establishing a dedicated major projects office designed to fast-track domestic infrastructure. This office aims to compress intense regulatory reviews into a strict maximum timeline of just 2 years. Carney has already used this legislation to push through well over $100 billion in proposed projects spanning LNG terminals, nuclear reactors, and deep water ports. The most dramatic manifestation of this panic occurred when Ottawa and the Alberta provincial government bypassed years of political animosity to sign a joint agreement for a brand new bitumen pipeline extending from the oil sand east to the British Columbia coast, running parallel to the expanded Trans Mountain line. Ottawa took the unprecedented step of declaring this proposed line a project of national interest, a legal designation meant to unlock accelerated approvals and bypass standard regulatory bottlenecks. Officials state that the formal application is slated to land by mid-2026. It is an incredibly fast timeline by historical Canadian standards, proving that the government finally understands the stakes of the continental capital race. But legislative promises on paper cannot immediately undo decades of regulatory trauma. The market remains deeply sceptical. Institutional investors know that national interest designations can still face prolonged challenges in federal courts from environmental coalitions and legal challenges. They know that a shift in political power could easily weaken or completely reverse these fast-track commitments. While Canada attempts to build a new regulatory framework, Enbridge's American utility and export expansions are already active, fully funded, and generating billions in reliable cash flow today. This creates a high-stakes race between two entirely different models of energy infrastructure development. On one side of the border stands an American system characterized by rapid execution, massive market demand, and proven corporate returns. On the other stands a newly awakened Canadian state apparatus attempting to use emergency legislation to force speed into a historically sluggish system. Enbridge sits precisely at the centre of this cross-border tug-of-war, operating as a multi-billion-dollar barometer for Canadian competitiveness. If Ottawa's fast-track experiments fail to deliver real steel in the ground within its promised 2-year window, the corporate tilt toward the United States will become permanent and irreversible. The headquarters may permanently stay in Calgary, but the true economic allegiance of Canada's largest energy giant will belong entirely to Washington. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we monitor this structural shift. The strategy is set, the billions are moving, but the most consequential question remains unanswered. This structural realignment did not happen through a series of open market purchases or gradual asset accumulation. It was executed through a highly synchronized, multi-stage transaction architecture that systematically bypassed traditional regulatory roadblocks. To understand how Enbridge pulled off the largest utility consolidation in recent continental history, we must look past the $14 billion sticker price and break down the exact financial and jurisdictional mechanics of the deal. The architecture of this transaction was built on 3 distinct purchase and sale agreements signed simultaneously on September 5, 2023 with Dominion Energy. Rather than buying a single consolidated holding company, Enbridge deliberately separated the target assets into 3 sovereign regional buckets. This prevented a single federal or state regulatory bottleneck from killing the entire master agreement. www.tradepractitioner.com first. Look at the acquisition of the East Ohio Gas Company, which closed on March 6, 2024, for a total value of $6.6 billion. Enbridge structured this specific piece with $4.3 billion in pure cash and the direct assumption of $2.3 billion in existing American corporate debt. Rebranded instantly as Enbridge Gas Ohio, this asset provided the firm with immediate scale in the heart of the American Rust Belt, capturing an industrial and manufacturing consumer base tethered closely to Appalachian shale gas production. www.investing.com issue 1 second. Consider the second phase executed on May 30, 2024, which brought Questar Gas Company and its highly lucrative upstream supply affiliate, the Wexpro Companies, into the Enbridge portfolio for $4.3 billion. The funding formula here mirrored the Ohio strategy, utilizing $3.0 billion in cash and assuming $1.3 billion in localized utility debt. Now operating as Enbridge Gas Utah, this acquisition gave the Canadian giant an unassailable footprint across Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. By controlling the Wexpro assets, Enbridge did not just buy delivery pipes. It secured direct ownership of the physical gas reserves under the ground, insulating its Western utility operations from raw market price volatility. w.investing.com. Issue 1/3. The final piece of the structural puzzle snapped into place on September 30, 2024, with the closing of Public Service Company of North Carolina for approximately $3.2 billion. Comprising $2.0 billion in cash and $1.2 billion in assumed debt. The newly christened Enbridge Gas North Carolina gave the Calgary firm direct exposure to the fastest-growing demographic and data center corridor on the American East Coast. Investors dominionenergy.com to fund this massive cash requirement without damaging its pristine investment-grade credit rating or flooding the market with dilutive equity shares, Enbridge deployed a sophisticated capital baking process. The company utilized pre-arranged transition services agreements with Dominion Energy to guarantee zero operational interruption during the handover. It then tapped global debt markets to lock in long-term fixed financing while simultaneously deploying internal distributable cash flow to clear the remaining balances. www.poornewswire.com is show 1. But the most critical component of the deal architecture was not the financial engineering, it was the regulatory sequencing. By breaking the deal into 3 geographically isolated transactions, Enbridge forced state regulators to evaluate each application based solely on local economic merit rather than continental market dominance. The critical regulatory hurdle cleared on January 11, 2024, when the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States issued full clearance without attaching a single structural mitigation or condition. Washington effectively rolled out the red carpet for Canadian capital to absorb its critical domestic distribution infrastructure. w.tradepractitioner.com. This brings us to the operational reality that has unfolded throughout 2025 and into early 2026, the management of American rate cases. In the utility world, profits are strictly bound by allowed rates of return determined by state public utility commissions. What the mainstream commentary misses is how beautifully Enbridge is playing these regulatory bodies to guarantee predictable revenue growth. Take the recent outcome from the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, issued in mid-2025. The Commission ordered a modest base rate revenue reduction of $26.3 million and established an allowed rate of return of 6.60%. To an outside observer reading a surface-level headline, this looks like a regulatory defeat for Enbridge. But look closer at the structural fine print of that order. The Commission explicitly authorized Enbridge Gas Ohio to fully continue its massive pipeline infrastructure replacement program and its capital expenditure recovery riders through 2028. This rider-eligible spending is the secret weapon of the deal. Architecture. Nearly 70% of Enbridge's planned utility capital expenditure across Ohio, Utah, and North Carolina is backed by these regulatory riders. This means Enbridge can bypass long, agonizing multi-year rate hearings to recover its capital deployment. As it replaces aging iron pipes with modern composite infrastructure, it automatically adjusts consumer delivery charges to claw back its investment in real time. The base rate return may be capped at 6.60%, but the guaranteed recovery of incremental capital turns these states into absolute cash machines. The underlying strategic imperative here is the explosive demographic reality of the chosen jurisdictions. According to data presented during Enbridge's 2025 and early 2026 investor days, population growth across these core American footprints is vastly outpacing the stagnant Canadian market. Between 2025 and 2029, North Carolina's population is projected to expand by 6.2%, Utah by 5.1%, and Ohio by a steady 1.0%. Every new subdivision built in Salt Lake City or Raleigh translates directly to a physical gas meter attached to an Enbridge asset. Furthermore, these specific states sit directly in the crosshairs of 3 massive macroeconomic tailwinds that text-only policy documents completely fail to visualize: coal to gas switching in heavy industry, baseload industrial manufacturing expansions, and the absolute insatiable electricity demand of modern artificial intelligence data centers. While Ottawa attempts to regulate natural gas out of the home heating market through federal clean electricity mandates, American states are actively leveraging cheap, abundant natural gas to prevent grid collapse. Enbridge did not just buy utilities. It bought a front-row seat to the electrification of the American economy. What this deal architecture ultimately reveals is a profound asymmetry in continental capital deployment. Enbridge has built a dual-engine corporate structure that extracts the maximum possible financial benefit from 2 completely different regulatory systems. In Canada, it maintains the Mainline, a highly utilised, cash-generative toll road that collects predictable fees on Western Canadian resource extraction. It then takes that Canadian resource cash and funnels it directly into high-growth, rider-protected American utility networks and Gulf Coast export facilities. This is the ultimate corporate hedge against domestic political risk. By shifting its core operating segment to American-regulated gas distribution, Enbridge has ensured that no matter what kind of environmental legislation, pipeline delay, or political instability originates out of Ottawa or provincial capitals, Its dividend aristocrat status remains entirely untouchable. The capital has been structurally reallocated to where it faces the path of least resistance and the highest velocity of return. Ottawa's newly established Major Projects Office and its 2-year approval mandate under the Building Canada Act are designed specifically to disrupt this exact corporate calculation. Mark Carney is attempting to build an institutional counterweight that can match the speed and capital certainty of the American state-level rider systems. But while Canada attempts to stand up this new legislative framework, Enbridge's $14 billion American asset base is already throwing off record EBITDA every single quarter, entirely independent of Canadian political approval. The financial plumbing of North American energy has been fundamentally re-engineered. But the ultimate geopolitical price of this re-engineering has yet to be tallied by the nation that birthed this empire. Enbridge's $14 billion acquisition of Dominion Energy's gas utilities reveals that Canada's flagship energy giant has structurally insulated its balance sheet from domestic regulatory friction. By converting heavy Canadian bitumen revenues into rider-protected, high-growth American utility networks and Gulf Coast export infrastructure, the company has masterfully aligned its corporate destiny with American industrial expansion. When you zoom out to the broader strategic horizon, this massive capital reallocation carries profound implications for the future of Canada-US relations and continental security. We are no longer living in the pre-Trump era of predictable, rule-based institutionalism, where cross-border trade flowed smoothly under the naive assumption that economic integration was inherently symmetric. The geopolitical reality of 2026 is defined by fierce, transactional competition, aggressive tariff threats, and a raw race for absolute supply chain resilience. In this cutthroat environment, energy infrastructure is no longer treated merely as a commercial asset class. It is weaponized as an instrument of national power. By building an unassailable utility empire squarely inside American borders, Enbridge has effectively created a corporate shield against the rising tide of continental protectionism. While political leaders in Washington threaten sweeping tariffs on Canadian manufacturing and battle Ottawa over agricultural quotas, they cannot easily disrupt an energy conglomerate that delivers essential heating and baseload power to millions of American homes across Ohio, Utah, and North Carolina. Furthermore, Enbridge's control over the Ingleside export terminal in Texas integrates Canadian corporate capital directly into Washington's global energy dominance strategy. As maritime choke points face chronic instability, the American Gulf Coast has become the premier clearinghouse for Western energy security. Canada is effectively financing and operating the very infrastructure that cements the United States as the ultimate global energy arbiter, even as Ottawa struggles to achieve its own direct access to global markets. This asymmetry highlights a stark, uncomfortable shift from the historical status quo. In the pre-Trump era, Canada took its status as America's primary energy partner for granted, believing that its resource wealth guaranteed geopolitical leverage. Today, that leverage is evaporating as the marginal Canadian growth dollar actively chooses to build up the American domestic economy. The capital flight pioneered by Enbridge acts as a powerful warning to the global alliance structure. If an advanced, resource-rich economy cannot maintain the domestic conditions necessary to attract and retain its own corporate capital, its sovereignty will slowly but surely be absorbed by the gravitational pull of its larger neighbour. The defensive counter-strategy launched by Prime Minister Mark Carney's government through the One Canadian Economy Act and the Building Canada Act presents a historic, last-ditch effort to break this continental dependency. For the first time in a generation, Ottawa is attempting to outmuscle the market by deploying sweeping executive powers to slash regulatory timelines down to a mandatory 2-year window. The recent fast-track approvals under the Major Projects Office, including Enbridge's own newly greenlit Sunrise natural gas expansion in British Columbia, and the unprecedented national interest designation for a new parallel bitumen pipeline to the Pacific Coast, prove that the state is finally willing to sacrifice bureaucratic process on the altar of economic survival. www.gljpc.com. But this heavy-handed legislative push introduces an entirely new set of systemic vulnerabilities. By bypassing traditional regulatory pathways and concentrating immense approval power within the federal cabinet, the Carney government is walking a perilous tightrope. This hyper-accelerated model is already facing intense, organised pushback from environmental coalitions and select Indigenous communities who argue that the fast-track mechanism undermines constitutional consultation requirements. The risk of prolonged multi-year litigation in federal courts remains dangerously high. If the Major Projects Office hits a wall of judicial gridlock, Canada's regulatory reputation will suffer a fatal blow, signalling to global markets that not even an Act of Parliament can guarantee execution certainty on Canadian soil. This brings us to the next critical juncture that will decide the ultimate fate of Canadian economic sovereignty. The true test of this national experiment will not be measured by legislative announcements or political rhetoric, but by the physical deployment of private capital over the next 12 months. Watch the formal application for the newly designated Parallel Pacific Bitumen Pipeline, slated to land in mid-2026. The velocity at which that project either clears its legal hurdles or bogs down in constitutional warfare will serve as the definitive referendum on Canadian competitiveness. If corporate boards look at Ottawa's new fast-track framework and still choose, say, to direct their capital toward rider-protected American expansions, the transition will be complete. Enbridge's massive financial pivot has laid bare the hidden plumbing of the continental energy race. The pieces are moving rapidly across the board, the regulatory clocks are ticking, and the window for Canada to assert true strategic autonomy is rapidly closing.